Hello, everyone. Welcome to Nodes 2020. My name is Catalina Arango. I'm a data scientist at Florida Power and Light, and I'm also the co founder of Our Ladies Miami. Our Ladies Miami is a global organization aimed at providing a safe and inclusive space for women and underrepresented groups in the R community. We are the Miami chapter, but like I said, it's a global organization. So today I'm very excited to present our speakers, Sean Griffin, who's the founder and CEO of Disaster Tech, and Leo Meyerovich, who's the founder of Graphistry. So Sean Griffin served as the director for incident management integration policy on the U.S. National Security Council at the White House and is an active duty veteran of the U.S. Navy and Naval Nuclear Power Program. During his White House term under two U.S. presidents, Sean led the Executive Office of the President and Interagency Policy Coordination for major disasters and incidents. Additionally, Sean led emergency management training and exercise programs at the U.S. Department of State, Defense Logistics Agency, and National Institutes of Health. He also volunteered time to chair the Federal Sector Emergency Managers Caucus for the International Association of Emergency Managers and is a leading member of the Private Sector Committee for the National Emergency Management Association. Leo founded Graphistry to supercharge visual investigations with GPUs, graphs, and automation. He has led working with many teams on problems challenging cybersecurity, fraud, cancer genomics, and even medical misinformation. Graphistry builds on his research at UC Berkeley. Leo's most referenced publications are in securing programming languages, and his award-winning projects include the first functional reactive web language, the first parallel web browser, programmable GPU visual analytics, and the sociological foundations of programming languages. These ideas are now used by popular browsers and web frameworks and received awards including SIGPlan 10-Year Test of Time, Best of Year, and multiple Best Paper awards. He helped start ProjectDomino.org, where citizen data scientists are tackling COVID medical misinformation. And now they will be presenting on this project. So Project Domino, fighting COVID misinformation at scale with citizen data scientists, Sean and Leo, welcome.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. And before we get started with our presentation, before I hand it off to my colleague Leo, we first want to acknowledge the incredible work that Neo4j has done through the Graphs for Good program, building a better world with connected data. Because of the Graphs for Good program, we've been able to support and launch all of the incredible work through Project Domino, and we couldn't have done it without the incredible partnership with Neo4j. So again, thank you so much for Neo4j for presenting this incredible talk and also providing us with all the support and continued support for Project Domino. So Project Domino is fighting COVID misinformation with graph data science. We have an incredible team led by myself, Leo Meyerovich, the founder and CEO of Graphistry, as well as Professor Anita Nikolic, who's at the University of Illinois, as well as Ezra's X, and Corey Webb, who's a researcher as well as a fellow Navy veteran. Today, we'll be talking about how we're using Neo4j and graph databases to fight misinformation, medical misinformation on COVID. Leo?
Thank you, Sean. So I'm going to start with a kind of a quick, maybe not so distant memory for many of us of just why we're active on this project. So if we rewind history back to mid-March, we saw this interesting tweet go up from Governor Kevin Stitt, where as news from Princess Diamond, Seattle and Kirkland, Bay Area, as Boston, as the initial breakouts were happening, Governor Stitt thought what was best for his constituents and posted onto Twitter, eating with my kids and all my fellow Oklahomans at the collective OKC. It's packed tonight, super local, Oklahoma proud, and essentially an endorsement to come out. As someone with family actively involved in medicine, family who was already at that point in time helping make basically testing kits because the local hospitals didn't have them. That was kind of a very weird thing to see. It was a lot of cognitive dissonance. And then if we fast forward a few months, all of a sudden, the unfortunate for Governor Stitt and his family, he tested positive, and alongside him, a lot of his constituents. And of course, at a national scale, that has now recently happened with our president. From an information perspective, this is kind of a not so surprising, but also kind of interesting. If we look at around that same period in time, that was actually around when most Americans basically did their research on masks. Even today, we still have a low level of mask usage. We've essentially lost that fight. But the interesting thing is that was kind of when the peak in search on masks happened. It was right around then. And if you look for social distancing, things like that, fairly similar. And 6 months later, 200,000 Americans dead. That's kind of an important thing. It's like a big part of this is that information battle. And to be clear, it's not just about masks. There's actually other public health considerations going forward. So even though the U.S. government lost the fight on masks, in effect, the next one that we're currently in is actually vaccines. And so even though there's no vaccine out yet, they're still getting proved in terms of safety and efficacy. We just don't know. The important thing is again, kind of like masks, is that public sentiment and what is the actual behavior that Americans are going to take. And so what we're seeing in this chart here is across all adults, and also a breakdown between Republican versus Democrat. Everyone is living in the same country. The virus doesn't care, as many people like to say. And what we're seeing is that even though there's no actual concrete vaccine with any actual choice with different characteristics for individuals to make decisions on, over the last few months, the willingness of U.S. adults to take the vaccine has overall dropped from 70% to 50%. And keep in mind, if you want to talk about herd immunity, vaccines, things like that, generally we do want to have 70% plus of the population taking that vaccine. And so we've, in a sense, lost the information battle before the vaccine is already out. And from a misinformation perspective, one of the most important things in messaging is actually basically you want to get ahead of the message. And so it's a lot easier to give somebody a concept, have them get on board with it, versus to have somebody make a decision for themselves in a vacuum, and then they have to backpedal. And if in the extreme case, we'll actually call that de-radicalization, and that's one of the most expensive forms of behavior change. And that's kind of where Project Domino comes in. And for that, I think this quote from the Director General from the World Health Organization put it quite well. We're not just fighting an epidemic, we're fighting an infodemic. This is very much true of COVID for behavior change, both social distancing, masks, and then later even for medical cures, things like actually taking the vaccine. And then it's also true, I think resonates with many, it's not just about medical misinformation, though that is what the focus of Project Domino. I do want to make some quick disclaimers here. Some of the things that we talk about in these talks, generally, they might be new information. Generally, when that's the case, we're actually working with other researchers who are performing responsible disclosure on those. And the other part is, while Project Domino is careful to be a nonpartisan group, the issue we care about is again, it's the public health issue. It is important to say that members of the team have been impacted by COVID. So this is we work against it. Team members get infected, et cetera. So we do care about this. And then, as you're seeing here, there we have volunteers and collaborators from throughout the community. So today I want to talk about a few things. So high level, I do want to talk about what is actually Project Domino, and then why we're thinking about graph to begin with. And then from there, I thought it would be interesting as kind of a case study in graph data science to understand how we think about scale, how do we think about visual analytics, and then how do we think about actually having a productive team of analysts, data scientists, and investigators. And I'll talk about technologies like Neo4j, Prefect, in GPU computing for graph. I'll talk about Graphistry and Rapids, and then on collaboration side, things like Jupyter and Streamlit. So kind of to get into Domino and the graph, it's useful to understand what when we talk about misinformation, what is the landscape? And in security, we call this a threat model. And what I think a lot of folks might think when we talk about misinformation is like some abstract notion of state-sponsored stuff, like the Russians, the Chinese, something like that. Or maybe they think about conspiracy theorists like UFO enthusiasts. Maybe they've heard of something called QAnon. But in terms of active misinformation, there's definitely these concentrated cores, but there's actually also opportunists. So let's say politicians who may not particularly subscribe to to a conspiracy theory, but they realize there's a nice voter base or a nice niche that they can carve out by appealing to, and they might want to ride the coattails. Likewise, the social media platforms, it's actually AI is one of the biggest proponents of misinformation. So whatever you see on Twitter, whatever you see on Facebook, on Instagram, anything that bubbles into your feed, which comment, like if there's 1,000 comments and only a few go into your screen, it's actually a recommendation AI that will pick which ones are the most engaging or the most, the most trollish to get that emotional reaction to keep you clicking and responding. So it's actually AIs that's also a big part of picking what misinformation spreads and gets seen. And so beyond the active misinformers, there's just the general channels that we think about. So you may think about social media platforms where it gets shared. A lot of it's actually dark, so it's email. So we don't really think about things like spam anymore because email takes such a good does such a good job on spam filters. But at the same time, a lot of misinformation graduates from social media into newsletters, things like that. And generally, that's the domain of we actually measured about 13 or so media companies. Think Google, Facebook, companies like that, Twitter. A few of them just take most of it. There's also a bit of a long tail. So imagine your local regional newspaper, and you go to the comment section of that website. There's each one of those is pretty tiny, but there's like a long tail that adds up. So we see both of those as pretty important. And then what's a little strange about how we have to go about thinking about defeating misinformation is that there's a lot of people that may not necessarily think of themselves as misinformers, but they're definitely part of supporting it, funding it, things like that. So for example, at tech companies, there might be a marketing automation company that's providing market intelligence and telling the misinformers. And think of these as like savvy digital folks. Like which techniques and campaigns are working, which are not. Let them quickly iterate through attempts. Let's say you're a corporate buyer, like working in marketing or sales, and you're buying ads, and you're deciding, hey, TV and radio, maybe that's not the thing for me. For our company, let's switch to Google ads and Twitter ads and social media ads. That actually is paying for the misinformers, helping them helping the social media companies decide that misinformation and engagement around misinformation is a valuable thing. So you're actually using your ad budget, even though you don't think of yourself as an active misinformation participant, you actually are funding the process just as a regular business that's otherwise unaffiliated. Likewise, government leaders and regulators, as politicians, some of them are active, but at the same time, others, this is sort of a toxic area that a lot of folks are afraid to regulate on. They're afraid to give funding on projects to combat. And so generally, the government has been very hands-off on this stuff. There's like public decency and public nuisance stuff that they'll use, actions they'll take elsewhere. But for something like medical misinformation, it's actually fairly hands-off. And so for somebody like Project Domino, we've now entered the world where, while contrasting to something like spam, everyone's willing to help, join in to can spam. People are not willing to work against misinformation. So it's a very adversarial setup. So generally, beyond just the misinformers, we generally have to take assume we trust very little about the social media platforms. We trust very little about government politicians and regulators. Currently, they're on the wrong default, so they're default pro misinformation and default status quo. So Project Domino, briefly, we do data engineering and data science around misinformation, specifically around medical misinformation and on COVID. We do not take direct action, but what we do is we partner with digital platforms who might be hosting content, with civic groups, imagine faith-based organizations whose constituents might be, out at risk, like they're elderly or something like that, and misinformation researchers who are actually doing hands-on research and kind of breaking stories. These folks are not, and also I'm going to be clear here. Sometimes these folks are trying to make kind of like spam, try to improve the filtering and decrease how much of the misinformation noise that there is. But other times it's about promoting positive information. So identifying influencers and making sure they're spreading the right message. So in these cases, where Project Domino fits is essentially open source. So we say, we're going to do the data and engineering and data science that these organizations are not necessarily set up to perform. We plug that in. And then to achieve the global scale necessary, we focus on being open. And so open source is the only way we can kind of collect those resources. So moving on a little here. So what is this graph that we're working with? So intuitively, the way that a lot of the team members, and especially, for example, me, the founder at Graphistry, we come from areas like digital forensics and AI. So in digital forensics, we might think about something like social media as okay, we might see a trail of accounts and tweets making some sort of graph. But at the forensic level, we might crawl out the URLs and see that the URLs are connected to domains. Those domains we can go and do, instead of just social analytics, we can now do web analytics. And then we can go from the web analytics to internet analytics and imagine something like an identity graph, things like that. And so we can start like teasing together just how widespread or how connected any kind of event or entity is across not just social media, but a little bit wider. And the graph lets us do things like search, pivot around, scope how big something is, see patterns and outliers, understand the community structure, understand the influencers, things like that. The kind of the first scaling thing I want to talk about here to work with a graph like that, I want to talk about just getting into the database. So we picked Neo4j because it's essentially, it could work at the scale we want. So we're spec'd at maybe 1 to 10 million social media events a day. And then our machine, we're talking about something about in the kind of 1 to 10 terabytes of analytic data a year. And you throw on some indexes and Neo4j deals pretty well. We focus more about the ingest pipeline on the software, how to actually get that data in there. It's been a bit of a journey. What I'm showing here is, for example, just by focusing on the single node, we were able to jump up, basically go from about 1 million per CPU or per node in our cluster. We were able to jump up for about maybe 1 million things a day to about, I think 4 or 5 million, and then we could do multiple nodes to go higher. And so we can actually get a nice chunk of data. I do want to do a call out to Twint and Prefect as technologies we also use here. Moving on a bit, I want to talk a bit about scaling the visualization. So now that we're actually getting, maybe 100 million things a month, how do you actually look at it? So what I'm showing here is, for example, we're looking at the network of one influential anti-vax person, and you're seeing these different colors. We use, this is where my company Graphistry comes in. We're just a graph visualization tool. But what's going on in this picture, for example, is we're seeing for one anti-vax community, on the top left, we're seeing the anti-vax and natural medicine folks. In the middle, we're seeing the influencers being connected. What's interesting is that by looking at the graph, we could see, for example, on the top right, we're seeing more of the alt-right being involved. And on the bottom left, I think it's more of the stronger conspiracy theorists, QAnon, UFOs, things like that. And then somewhere in the middle here, I think we actually have the MAGA movement is actually pretty surprisingly loud in anti-vax. The reason that I wanted to bring up Graphistry here in terms of scale is, I'm going to show kind of a quick visualization here. I think this tab would be a better one. So the previous graph I was showing was just people following each other on Twitter. But in this case, what we're looking at is, again, we're looking at each node as an account. But in this case, we actually use machine learning to infer that certain accounts are actually likely bots that are the same account. And then we were kind of almost creating almost like a textual fingerprint of posting the same things. And where GPU technologies like Graphistry come in is, yes, we have maybe about 5,000 accounts for this analysis that came in. But even for 5,000 accounts, once we ran machine learning to sort of connect those accounts together when they behave similarly, so all these edges here represent basically an identity match across by doing the natural language processing, we can actually have about 100,000 of these connections on screen. And then we can kind of make them live and interactive. You see here, I'm doing kind of live clustering. And in this case, for example, we were looking at which are the most active groups across conspiracy theories. And so being able to take that data, but then have the analysts be able to look at it in a scalable way is an important part of our analytic process. For folks doing more on the data science side, we find something like UMAP is one of our more powerful tools. The last piece that I want to next piece I want to talk about on scaling is actually Jupyter is kind of collaboration tools. So one of the ones we use a lot is something called Jupyter. Jupyter notebooks. Let's see if I can pull this up here as well. Jupyter notebooks are great for our like data engineers, our data scientists, a place for them to collaborate. Where here you can see that we might write like a Cypher query, run some machine learning, and then a few lines later we can just hit plot, share, get the result, and then share that analysis to somebody else. It's almost like Word documents, but for data people. At the same time, this is a little too low level for other folks on our team. So there we use tools like Streamlit, where we can quickly go from Python to dashboard. And so that's also important. And then the last one I want to kind of talk about is more at the data engineering level tools we use there. So I do want to note that one of the reasons we picked Neo4j is beyond just being sort of the center hub for Project Domino, is that we realize that the Cypher query language is one of the most approachable of the graph query languages. Other databases have other strengths, but we really like Neo4j for Cypher. And then in turn, we don't actually do analytics inside of Neo4j. We then take it into those kind of Python data frames. And that's where we use tools like Graphistry for visualization, and then something called rapids.ai for the analytics. So if you're familiar with pandas or NetworkX or R or things like that, that's basically taking those same concepts, that same little high level thing, except for that same code will run on GPUs. And so that's, if you want to deal with like a billion node graph, that's kind of an interesting way to do it. So stepping back, now that you've gotten a sense, hopefully what you're getting a sense of is misinformation is something that we can think about tackling, just as how we tackled spam. It's this, and we do digital forensics and things like that every day. It is a manageable thing. Technology-wise, we're in a new era of AI and data engineering. You're seeing, for example, the use of GPU computing. We can do this stuff. It's a little harder than spam because currently the ecosystem is essentially corrupted. I don't think people intended for these technologies to be used this way, and they don't actively think about our individual role in misinformation. And that's hopefully a thing you can change, starting with yourself. If you work in a marketing department or sales department, be more careful with where your money goes. If be careful where you vote, things like that. And then at the same time, this is sort of as a kind of a call to rally here. If you are in data, you're a data scientist, a data engineer, developer. We think that taking an open citizen science approach to misinformation is a good way to essentially pool resources from across the community and actually have that scale that we need to tackle such a problem that historically there has been no such institution. So check out projectdomino.org, join the Slack, and we'd love to work with you. And then likewise, if you're on the corporate or federal side, while it is a volunteer organization, we are looking to get sponsorship for things like hardware and to support a core team to support everything else year round. So with that, I want to say thank you for taking time to kind of hear about this important message and encourage you to volunteer. And Sean and I will be around to help with Q&A. Thank you, everyone.